January 23rd, 2026, 11:47 p.m., Greenlandic Standard Time. The Greenland Parliament building in Nuuk witnessed an unprecedented emergency session that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Arctic region. At exactly 11:52 p.m., Prime Minister Muntebor Begede signed Emergency Resolution 2026-01, formally activating Defense Protocol Article 7, a provision that grants Greenlandic authorities the power to suspend all foreign mining operations and revoke exploration licenses during periods of existential threat to territorial sovereignty. The immediate target was unmistakable: China Geological Survey Corporation's $47 billion rare earth mining consortium, which controlled exploration rights to approximately 34% of Greenland's mineral-rich territory. Within 6 hours, Chinese personnel at 17 different mining sites received formal evacuation orders. By dawn, Greenlandic Coast Guard vessels had established security perimeters around mining facilities that contained what analysts estimate to be the largest concentrated deposit of critical minerals outside Chinese territory. The activation was not triggered by military threat or environmental disaster. It was a response to intelligence provided by Danish security services indicating that Chinese mining operations had systematically exceeded their licensing agreements, establishing permanent infrastructure that resembled military installations rather than temporary extraction facilities. The evidence included unauthorized communication arrays, underground facility construction, and personnel deployment patterns that suggested strategic rather than commercial objectives. But the most telling aspect of the crisis was what didn't happen. No emergency session of the Danish Parliament, no diplomatic protest from Beijing, no statement from the U.S. State Department. The activation of Greenland's most extreme defense protocol proceeded with the quiet efficiency of a long-planned operation, suggesting that all major powers had been preparing for this moment far longer than public statements had indicated. The Chinese presence in Greenland had been building systematically for over 8 years, beginning with modest geological surveys, and gradually expanding into comprehensive resource extraction operations that dwarfed anything attempted in the Arctic before. China Geological Survey Corporation, operating through subsidiary companies registered in Denmark and Luxembourg, had invested $47 billion in Greenlandic infrastructure since 2018, making Beijing the largest foreign investor in Greenland's history. The investment was not limited to mining equipment. Chinese companies had constructed 3 deep-water ports capable of handling ice-class cargo vessels, established year-round research stations in locations that provided strategic surveillance of North Atlantic shipping routes, and built communication networks that connected Greenlandic mining sites directly to Chinese military satellites rather than Danish or European systems. The scope of Chinese operations had exceeded anything contemplated in the original licensing agreements signed with the Greenlandic government. Rare earth mining permits had been expanded to include lithium extraction, uranium prospecting, and oil exploration. Temporary research facilities had been converted into permanent installations with underground storage capabilities and defensive positioning that suggested military rather than commercial planning. But the true extent of Chinese strategic objectives became apparent through intelligence analysis rather than official reports. Danish military reconnaissance had identified construction patterns at Chinese facilities that resembled People's Liberation Army forward operating bases rather than civilian mining operations. Personnel rotations followed military deployment schedules. Equipment manifests included dual-use technologies with obvious surveillance and communication warfare applications. The official Chinese position, communicated through carefully worded statements from the Ministry of Natural Resources, emphasized cooperative development of Arctic resources for mutual benefit and scientific research collaboration in polar geology. No mention was made of the military-grade infrastructure or the strategic positioning that characterized actual operations. The language was diplomatic and reassuring, designed to suggest commercial partnership rather than territorial expansion. Yet the silence from Western governments was equally revealing. The United States had been tracking Chinese Arctic activities through intelligence partnerships with Denmark and Norway, but had avoided public confrontation that might accelerate Chinese militarization of the region. The European Union had expressed concern about Chinese Arctic expansion while continuing to approve exploration permits that enabled further Chinese investment. The Greenlandic government found itself caught between Chinese economic necessity and Western security concerns. Chinese investment represented nearly 40% of Greenland's GDP and employment for approximately 15,000 Greenlandic workers. But the scope of Chinese operations threatened to compromise Greenlandic sovereignty in ways that mining agreements had never contemplated. The decision to activate Defense Protocol Article 7 represented a choice between economic dependence and political independence. Resource warfare. Escalation in Greenland as activation of defense protocols instantly created the most significant rare earth supply crisis since China's 2010 export restrictions during the Senkaku Islands dispute. Chinese-controlled mining operations in Greenland had been supplying approximately 23% of global rare earth production outside China, providing the only significant alternative source for critical minerals essential to renewable energy technology, defense systems, and consumer electronics. The suspension of Chinese operations meant that Western manufacturers faced immediate supply shortages for materials required in wind turbine manufacturing, electric vehicle battery production, and advanced semiconductor fabrication. Tesla's gigafactory operations faced potential delays due to rare earth magnet shortages. European wind energy projects encountered material cost inflation that threatened project viability. Defense contractors with rare earth-dependent weapon systems found themselves dependent on Chinese sources they could no longer access. The crisis exposed the extent to which Western governments had failed to develop strategic mineral independence despite decades of warnings about Chinese resource dominance. Emergency consultations convened between the Pentagon, European Commission, and major technology companies revealed that alternative rare earth sources would require 5 to 10 years to develop and trillions in infrastructure investment. Chinese response was immediate but strategically measured. Beijing announced temporary suspension of rare earth exports to countries participating in illegal seizure of Chinese commercial assets. Language that avoided direct confrontation while creating maximum economic pressure. Rare earth prices spiked 340% within 48 hours as global markets recognized the supply shock magnitude. Arctic militarization. The Greenlandic crisis accelerated military positioning in the Arctic that had been proceeding gradually for years, but now became urgent and visible. Within 72 hours of the Chinese evacuation orders, U.S. Air Force transports began delivering Arctic research equipment to Thule Air Base in northwestern Greenland. The equipment manifests were classified, but the cargo tonnage and handling requirements suggested military hardware rather than scientific instruments. Russian response was equally rapid and concerning. Northern Fleet submarines increased Arctic patrol frequency by 400%, ostensibly for routine navigation safety, but actually to monitor Western military buildups in response to the Chinese evacuation. The Arctic Ocean, which had been gradually militarizing for years, suddenly resembled the Cold War standoff zones that had characterized U.S.-Soviet confrontation decades earlier. NATO activated Article 4 consultations regarding Arctic security, but the alliance faced strategic complexities that traditional frameworks could not address. Greenland was technically Danish territory, but Greenlandic authorities had acted independently of Danish government coordination. Chinese operations were commercial rather than military, complicating the legal basis for NATO response. The Arctic was becoming a strategic theater for which Western military doctrine provided no clear guidelines. European Union officials privately acknowledged that Arctic militarization represented an existential challenge to European security architecture. Chinese control over Greenlandic resources could enable economic pressure that traditional military deterrence could not counter. Russian Arctic capabilities could threaten European energy supplies and communication networks that NATO protection could not guarantee. Climate geopolitics. The Greenlandic crisis occurred precisely as climate change was accelerating Arctic transformation in ways that made the region strategically vital for global power competition. Greenland's ice sheet was melting at record rates, exposing mineral resources that had been inaccessible for centuries, while creating new shipping routes that bypassed traditional choke points controlled by Western navies. Chinese Arctic strategy had been designed around climate projections that showed year-round shipping access through Arctic routes by 2035. Reducing Chinese dependence on maritime corridors controlled by U.S. and allied naval forces. The Northwest Passage and Northeast Passage represented alternative trade routes that could transform global commerce while reducing Chinese vulnerability to naval blockade during potential conflicts. The activation of Greenlandic defense protocols threatened to deny China access to Arctic resources precisely as climate change was making those resources essential for global power competition. Chinese investment in Arctic infrastructure had been calculated to secure a strategic advantage in the post-climate change world order. The Greenlandic response represented Western determination to prevent Chinese Arctic dominance regardless of economic costs. But climate change also created urgency that made compromise difficult for all parties. Western countries needed Arctic resources for a renewable energy transition. China required Arctic access for economic security in a warming world. Greenland faced environmental catastrophe that only international cooperation could address. The crisis occurred at the intersection of climate emergency and great power competition in ways that made resolution politically impossible. Sovereignty. Paradox. The Chinese evacuation revealed fundamental contradictions in Greenlandic sovereignty that had been masked by economic prosperity but could not survive strategic confrontation. Greenland was technically an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, but Danish authorities had limited practical control over Greenlandic natural resources or foreign policy decisions. The decision to activate defense protocols had been made by Greenlandic authorities without Danish parliamentary approval or European Union consultation. Yet Greenland lacked independent military capabilities to enforce the Chinese evacuation without Danish and NATO support. Greenlandic sovereignty was real enough to make independent decisions, but insufficient to implement those decisions without external assistance. Chinese legal challenges to the evacuation orders exposed the complexity of Greenlandic legal status in international law. Beijing argued that mining agreements had been signed with legally recognized Danish authorities and could not be unilaterally voided by Greenlandic regional governments. The legal dispute threatened to create precedents that could undermine indigenous sovereignty claims worldwide while strengthening Chinese legal position for similar operations in other Arctic territories. The moment of irreversible transformation came not from government decisions or military positioning, but from a single statement issued by China's State Council at 3:22 p.m. Beijing time on January 27th. The statement, consisting of only 127 characters in Chinese, announced that Arctic resource cooperation requires recognition of Chinese territorial waters extending to 200 nautical miles from permanent Chinese installations. The statement represented a fundamental challenge to international law governing Arctic territories and maritime boundaries. China was claiming territorial waters around mining facilities in Greenland, effectively asserting sovereignty over Greenlandic territory based on infrastructure investment rather than treaty rights or historical claims. The precedent threatened to revolutionize international law in ways that could fragment global governance of territorial disputes. Emergency sessions convened simultaneously in Copenhagen, Washington, Brussels, and Ottawa, as Western governments recognized that Chinese territorial claims in Greenland could establish precedent for similar claims in Antarctica, the South China Sea, and any location where Chinese investment created permanent installations. The legal principle threatened to transform commercial investment into territorial expansion on a global scale. The Danish government faced an impossible choice between defending Greenlandic sovereignty and avoiding military confrontation with China over Arctic territories. Supporting Greenlandic independence from Chinese control could trigger Chinese claims that would require military response Denmark could not provide. Accepting Chinese territorial claims would establish precedent that could fragment Danish sovereignty over Greenland entirely. NATO Article 5 provided no guidance for scenarios where territorial claims were based on commercial investment rather than military invasion. Alliance officials privately acknowledged that traditional security frameworks were obsolete for conflicts that operated through international law and economic pressure rather than military force. The alliance faced strategic challenges for which it had no doctrine or capabilities. The crisis had moved beyond resource competition or territorial dispute to challenge fundamental principles of international sovereignty and legal authority. Chinese success in establishing territorial claims based on investment could transform global governance in ways that traditional military power could not prevent or reverse. The stakes had escalated beyond Greenlandic resources to encompass the entire framework of international law. 4 weeks after the activation of Defense Protocol Article 7, Chinese personnel had completed evacuation from Greenlandic mining facilities, but the infrastructure remained under Chinese legal control through international arbitration proceedings that could continue for years. Greenlandic authorities had achieved tactical victory in asserting sovereignty over their territory, but strategic questions about resource control and territorial claims remained unresolved and potentially unresolvable through existing legal frameworks. The crisis had revealed something more fundamental than Arctic competition or resource scarcity. It had exposed the inability of current international law to address territorial expansion through economic investment in an era where climate change was creating new territories and resources faster than governance frameworks could adapt. The principles that had maintained international stability since World War II were proving inadequate for managing territorial disputes that operated through commercial law rather than military force. Arctic militarization continued to accelerate as all major powers recognized that climate change had created a new strategic theater that existing alliance structures could not govern effectively. Chinese territorial claims based on infrastructure investment established precedent that could be applied globally. Russian Arctic capabilities threatened Western supply chains that traditional naval power could not protect. Western response capabilities were constrained by alliance frameworks designed for different types of conflicts. The Greenlandic crisis represented the emergence of a new form of international competition that combined territorial expansion, resource control, legal warfare, and climate adaptation in ways that traditional strategic thinking could not address comprehensively. The resolution would require new frameworks for international governance that did not yet exist and might not be achievable through existing diplomatic institutions. Economic implications continued to reverberate through global supply chains as rare earth prices remained elevated and alternative sources proved insufficient to replace Chinese Arctic production. Western governments faced a choice between economic dependence on Chinese resources or massive infrastructure investment that would require decades to complete. The decision would determine technological capabilities and economic competitiveness for a generation. The silence that had characterized initial responses to the crisis had given way to careful management of permanent uncertainty. Arctic governance had become too complex for existing institutions, but too important for ad hoc solutions. Climate change was creating new territories and resources faster than international law could establish authority over them. Great power competition was operating through legal and economic mechanisms that military deterrence could not address. In the end, the Greenlandic crisis marked the beginning of a new era where sovereignty would be determined by infrastructure investment rather than military control, where territorial claims would be established through legal interpretation rather than historical precedent, and where climate change would create strategic territories faster than governance frameworks could manage them. The implications extended far beyond Arctic resources to encompass fundamental questions about international order in a world where geography itself was changing faster than politics could adapt. The defense protocol that had been designed to protect Greenlandic sovereignty had instead revealed that sovereignty itself was becoming obsolete as a framework for managing territorial disputes in an interconnected world where economic investment could establish territorial claims that military force alone could not resolve. The future of international governance would be determined not by the resolution of the Greenlandic crisis, but by whether new frameworks could be developed to manage similar crises that were inevitable, as climate change created new territories and resources that existing legal systems could not govern effectively.